Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So as per the neutral theory of molecular evolution, most of the mutations are either selectively neutral or nearly so, and thus the genetic variation within species results from the random genetic drift. Now let's consider a population of size n with a neutral mutation rate at a particular locus lambda with mutations per gamete per generation. Now the number of new mutations will be lambda multiplied by 2n, that is the diploid total population size. Probability of fixation by genetic drift can be given by frequency p, which is equal to 1 by 2n. Now the number of new mutations per generation that are likely to become fixed by genetic drift, that means the rate of evolution we are talking about here, is equal to number of mutations, that is lambda multiplied by 2n multiplied by the probability of fixation, that is 1 by 2n. So lambda multiplied by 2n multiplied by 1 by 2n give rise to lambda only, which is nothing but the mutation rate at that particular locus. So the number of new mutations per generation that are likely to become fixed by genetic drift is equal to the mutation rate lambda. So it actually proves a mathematical form of the neutral theory of molecular evolution, which says that evolution rate is directly related to the mutation rate, and that mutation is also the neutral mutations particularly. Now what are the observations which are consistent with the neutral theories? That means the supporting evidence. In protein sequences, conservative changes, that means the substitution of amino acids that have similar biochemical properties and are therefore less likely to affect the function of proteins, occur much more frequently than the radical changes. Synonymous base substitutions occur almost always at a much higher rate than the non-synonymous substitutions. So again, both of the points are supporting the neutral mutations. Non-coding sequences such as introns evolve at a higher rate similar to that of synonymous sites. So it is occurring more in case of non-coding sequences. Pseudogenes or the dead genes evolve at a higher rate, and this rate is about the same in the 3 codon position. So all these incidences which are coming from the advancement of molecular sequences or the bioinformatics branches, they do support the neutral theory of molecular evolution. Now let's quickly discuss what is the contrast or the conflict between the neutralist and the selectionist views or approaches. Though both recognize that the natural selection is responsible for the adaptation of organisms to their environment, and they also recognize that most new mutations in functionally important regions are deleterious, and that purifying selection can remove these deleterious mutations from the population. These are the common views which both of them agree. But the dispute between these two relates only to the relative proportion of the neutral and advantageous mutations. How much is actually the neutral mutations contribution and how much is actually the advantageous mutations contribution to the sequence divergence and polymorphism. So what divergence at the molecular level which we see, which actually leads to polymorphism in the sequences, individual and the population, how much is coming from the advantageous mutations and how much is coming from the neutral mutations? That is the basic contradiction between the neutralist and the selectionist. Now, having said that, we also need to understand that different proteins evolve at very different rates. Rates of amino acid changes in three proteins like fibrinopeptides, hemoglobin and cytochrome C, which has been shown here. These three proteins show different rates of changes per unit time. However, for each protein, the rate of changes per unit time appears to be approximately constant, and that is why you are seeing a linear relationship between the amino acid changes per 100 residue shown here on the y-axis and the million of years since divergence, that is the time shown on the x-axis. So this linear relationship proves this point. If these trends hold for other proteins and for all species comparison, we can easily use the molecular differences to date species divergence. So, if this neutral theory based observation is true, we can utilize this information to date the divergence point, when these two species evolved or diverged. So that dating can be done using this phenomena. Here you can see the rate of evolution of different proteins which has been narrated here, and that can be utilized to form something which we call as molecular clock hypothesis, which can be used to see in the evolutionary history when did two organisms or species diverged. So moving ahead with the third part of our lecture today, that is molecular clock hypothesis, which can also be called as gene clock or the evolutionary clock. So just like a normal clock which you see at homes or at your wristwatch, same ways there is something called molecular clock. So this constant nature which we just saw in the previous slides can be used to trace back the evolutionary history in terms of divergence. Let us see what do we mean by that. Just like a clock, it is a tool used to calculate the timing of evolutionary events. But instead of measuring seconds, minutes and hours just like in a normal clock, it measures the number of changes or basically the mutations which accumulate in the gene sequences of different species over the evolutionary time. So instead of normal seconds, minutes and hours, it basically measures the mutations or the changes which have accumulated in the sequences of different species through time. Thus, it helps to fix the date when two species diverged on the evolutionary timeline. So this molecular clock hypothesis is based on the neutral theory of evolution, and it can be used to predict the time of divergence, species divergence through evolution. The molecular clock is a technique that uses mutation rate of biomolecules to deduce the time in prehistory when two or more life forms diverged. The biomolecular data used for such calculations are usually nucleotide sequences of DNA or the amino acid sequences of proteins. The benchmarks for determining the mutation rates are often the fossils or archaeological dates. Now, what do we mean by this? I'll explain in the coming slides. The molecular clock hypothesis was first given by Emil Zuckerkandl and Linus Pauling in the year 1962, who noticed that the number of amino acid differences in hemoglobin between different lineages change roughly linearly with time as estimated from the fossil evidence. So remember that in the previous slides we saw the hemoglobin and cytochrome C which showed the linear relationship. The same thing was observed based on hemoglobin sequences from different lineages or species which changed linearly with time as estimated by the fossil evidence, which led to the formation of molecular clock hypothesis. A similar observation was there by E. Margoliouth in the year 1963, who gave the phenomena of genetic equidistance. Now let us quickly see what he said. It appears that the number of residue differences between cytochrome C Remember, his work is based on the cytochrome C, unlike the uh, hemoglobin which was used by the Zuckergandl and the Pauling. So the number of residue differences between cytochrome C of any two species is mostly conditioned by the time elapsed since the lines of evolution leading to these two species originally diverged. If this is correct, the cytochrome C of all mammals should be equally different from the cytochrome C of all birds. Since fish diverges from the mainstream stem of vertebrate evolution earlier than either birds or mammals, the cytochrome C of both mammals and birds should be equally different from the cytochrome C of the fish. Similarly, all vertebrate cytochrome C should be equally different from the yeast protein. So this is something we are talking about, the genetic equidistance. So let's say if we are comparing cytochrome C of fishes with the cytochrome C of birds and mammals, since birds and mammals diverged much earlier from the fishes, so there will be an equidistance relationship in terms of differences in cytochrome C between the fishes and birds and mammals. Whereas if you compare it, say mammals with the yeast, it will be totally different scenario. This hypothesis is based on the neutral theory which we discussed in the second part. From the comparative studies of hemoglobin and cytochrome C, Zuckerkandl and Pauling and Margoliouth noticed that the rates of amino acid substitution in these proteins were approximately the same among various mammalian lineages. And they also noticed that these substitutions were roughly proportional to time as judged against the fossil record. Now, why we are again and again telling about the fossil record related things? Because they help in the calibration of this clock. We will discuss it when we'll talk about the calibration of molecular clock. First question that comes to our mind is, we are talking about hemoglobin and cytochrome C. Question is, how to decide or select the protein for these kind of evolutionary relationship studies. For that selection, we need to focus upon certain points. A rapidly evolving protein ultimately becomes so altered in sequences between diverging organisms that the relationship is no longer recognizable. Whereas, if it is a very slow evolving protein, it will show little or no difference between the two different organisms. So, both things are not going to work if it is a rapidly evolving protein or if it is a slow evolving proteins. Therefore, a slowly changing sequences should be used to work out distant evolutionary relationship, and a fast evolving sequences should be used for closely related organisms. So depending on which organisms you are comparing, which species you are comparing, you need to select the protein based on that. If it is a closely related organisms, you need to have a fast evolving sequence. If it is a distantly placed organisms, you can have a slow evolving sequences for that. So selection depends on which organisms you are comparing for the evolutionary relationships. Let's take an example of ribosomal RNA, which is a slow ticking clock. That means this you can use for distantly related organisms. For a global evolutionary tree having all living organisms, now when we are saying all living organisms, they are totally distantly placed. There is a whole lot of organisms of different species or groups are there. The selected molecule should be present in all. The condition should be this molecule, whichever you are selecting, it should be present in all organisms, and it must be slowly evolving one. So as we discussed in the previous slide, if you are having a large variety of organisms which are distantly related in evolutionary history, you need to select a molecule which is slowly evolving, but it should be present in all the organisms. So based on rRNA, that is ribosomal RNA, you can make a phylogenetic tree of all the organisms like these. In contrast, let's talk about mitochondrial DNA, which is a rapidly ticking clock. So that means the rate of evolution is much higher in case of mitochondrial DNA, which is a rapidly evolving sequence. Now, this you can use if you have more closely related organisms to compare for evolutionary history. The mitochondrial DNA accumulates mutation faster than the nuclear genes. Hence, it is suitable for evolutionary relationship of closely related species or races of the same species. Most of the variations exist in D loop. Hence, it is used to distinguish people from different racial groups. Since all mitochondria are inherited from mother, it provides unambiguous female ancestry. So that is the advantage also, that the female ancestry, which is unambiguous, can be traced back using mitochondrial DNA because it has no interference through nuclear genes, and it is being used in human evolutionary studies. Also, there is a technical advantage with usage of mitochondrial DNA because the number of mitochondria and the amount which you can retrieve is much higher as compared to the nuclear genes. So there is a technical advantage also besides all these. Now coming to the molecular clock's calibration. Just like a normal clock, when you need to calibrate, for example, if you are starting a new clock, you need to calibrate it to the present time. So what you do is you take the new clock and you set its time seeing at the time which is there in the already working clock, right? So this is called calibration. Now, if we are using molecular clock, that means a sequence based, neutral sequence based clock for evolutionary history relationship checking and so on, you need to calibrate that clock also. So in order to calibrate the molecular clock, one must know the absolute age of some evolutionary divergence event which can be used to calibrate this. An estimate of timing of this event can be gained either by the examination of the fossil record. That is why we were using always the fossil record, because if you have a fossil record, you can have prediction of its age or the timing, which can be used to trace, or which can be used to calibrate your molecular clock. Besides fossil record, you can also use the by correlation of this particular instance of evolutionary divergence with some geological event of known antiquity. So either you find a fossil which you can date back, or some geological event whose date is known, that can be used to calibrate your molecular clock. Once calibrated, it can then be applied to other organisms to estimate the timing of evolutionary events. So for the basic calibration, you need to use some event or the fossil record whose date is already known. Once you calibrate your molecular clock, then you can utilize it to date or predict the evolutionary history of unknown samples. Now, let's take the phylogenetic relationship among primates based on the pseudogene globin. Let's see how we use the molecular clock. So here the sequence of what you can say is the sequence coming from a pseudogene, globin pseudogene, from different organism has been shown, and based on these molecular sequences, a phylogenetic tree has been prepared. Now the organisms which has been taken are the humans, chimpanzee, gorilla, orangutan, rhesus monkey, and a distantly related organism which is working as an outgroup here, the spider monkey has been taken, and these numbers basically indicate the minimum possible nucleotide substitution which produce the phylogeny. Let's not bother about whether it's parsimonious or the likelihood or other types. So based on this molecular sequence and phylogenetic tree, let's see how we can use the molecular clock. So I'm just taking the phylogenetic tree here. Now the hominoids diverged from the lineage leading to old world monkeys, that is Cercopithecidae, represented here by the rhesus monkey here, right? And if you see the timings, there have been almost 76 plus 14 plus 70 plus 150. So that means some of them, that is 300 base pair changes, have occurred in the lineages which has changed or diverged humans from the rhesus monkey. So let's see it from this point. This is the point from where the rhesus monkey and this humans diverged. In order to reach to the humans from this point, 150 plus 70 plus 14 plus 76, that is in total 310 base pair changes have occurred. The oldest fossil of Cercopithecus monkeys has been dated at around 25 million years. So let's say, using the fossil record which we can use for calibration of our clock, the timing we have got is 25 million years, providing a minimal estimate of time since divergence between the rhesus monkey and hominoids. So the time of divergence using fossil record is 25 million years, and the changes in the molecular sequences are around 310 base pairs. Now, the number of substitution per base pair per million years for the rhesus monkey can be calculated as, since rhesus monkey has shown 457 from this point, 457 base pair substitution, and the time which we have got is 25 million years. So the number of substitution per base pair, since the study is from 10,000 base pairs, we are calculating the number of substitution per base pair. So we are dividing it by total base pairs number, which is 10,000, divided by the time, that is 25 million years. So we get the rate as 1.83 into 10 to the power minus 3 per million years, or 1.83 into 10 to the power minus 9 per year. Now, from the common ancestor to Homo, the average rate has been, since we talked about 310 base pair substitution from this point, so 310 divided by 10,000 divided by 25, this rate comes out to be 1.24 into 10 to the power minus 3 per million years. Now, since we are talking about divergence of humans and rhesus monkey, and this is the divergence point, so 310 here and 457 here, we can predict the average rate at which substitutions have occurred in each lineage. That means 457 plus 310 divided by 2, which comes out to be 383.5, divided by 10,000 divided by 25 million years. So this average rate comes out to be 1.534 into 10 to the power minus 3 per million year. So that means this is how we use the molecular sequences or the neutral molecular substitutions, and we calibrate them using some fossil records to have the molecular clock, and this is how we calculate the average rates of substitutions or the divergence using this data. So what are the uses of this molecular clock? As we just saw, we can use it to estimate evolutionary rate, particularly in the lack of fossil record. So for the organisms for which you get the fossils, for them it is easier to predict their age or their dates, but the organisms for which you do not have fossils, so let's say a porphyrin for which you do not have the fossils, but if you have certain molecular sequences which are common, or the proteins which are common, so you can use their rate of evolution to predict the evolutionary divergence or the evolutionary history of those kind of organisms. Also, it helps us to put evolutionary events in chronological order. As we saw in case of the globin genes, the 5 globin genes can be placed in chronological orders in evolution based on their sequences and so on, or their divergence based on so on. Also, we can find the common ancestry using this molecular clock. So these are the some of the uses of molecular clock. But this molecular clock is not that simple. It has also some controversies associated with it. For example, the variable substitution rates are there among genes in different species due to differences in generation time and the rate of mutations. So for these, the problem is there. Evolution of same molecule at different rates in different evolutionary lines is there. So that is another controversial point. Considerable deviations in the rates of divergence in regulatory genes, introns, transposons, and the gene families. So these are some of the points which are controversial while we are using molecular clock or neutral theory based assumptions to predict the evolutionary history and the divergence. But still, if we use it, let's see how we can make use of it. Suppose the proportion of base pairs that differ between the pseudogene globin pseudogene sequences of two primate species is 0.0256. This is just an assumption. Now, assuming a molecular clock, D is equal to 2RT, means D here represents the proportion of base pairs that differ between the two sequences. R is the rate of divergence per base pair per million year, and T is the time in million years since the species common ancestor. And the factor 2 represents the two diverging lineages. That means we are using two, since we are using two different lineages, so 2 is being used here. Now if D equals to 0.0256 and R equals to 0.001534, which we discussed or estimated from the data shown in the previous slides, then the T, or the time when that common ancestor existed, that can be calculated using this. So it comes out to be 8.3 million years, which is the best estimate of the time when the two species diverged from their common ancestry. So this example shows that how we can use molecular clock to predict the time since the species common ancestor has existed. So that point of divergence which we are talking since beginning, that this evolutionary divergence can be predicted using molecular clock. This is how it is being done. Okay, so since we have covered the basic components of molecular evidences, then followed by the neutral theory of molecular evolution, and lastly the molecular clock hypothesis, here we come to summarize all these points. We discussed about the molecular evidences in terms of universality in terms of genetic material, that is DNA, the structural composition of this genetic material or DNA, the universality of genetic code and the triplet nature of codon. Then we discussed how the basic principles of gene expression are same across the organisms and present a molecular evidence of evolution. Then we talked about the homologies which is present in the molecular sequences in terms of orthologous, paralogous and xenologous sequences. We also talked about how gene duplication and divergence and pseudogenes as well can be used as an evidence of evolution at the molecular level. Once we had this basic idea of molecular evidences, we moved to discuss the neutral theory of Motu Kaimura for molecular evolution. We discussed what its postulates are and the mathematical expression of that. We talked about various supporting evidence for that. We discussed how neutralist view is different from the selectionist view, and we discussed the differences in evolutionary rates of different proteins. And based on this neutral theory, then we move to discuss what is called as molecular clock hypothesis. So what hypothesis says about the molecular clock? How do we select a suitable molecule to generate this kind of molecular clock? What are the uses of this? How do we calibrate this molecular clock? And various the controversies which are associated with the usage of molecular clock. So I will suggest you this web link and various books by, let's say, Nee and Kumar on molecular evolution and phylogenetics, by Ridley, by Hall and Hallgrimsson and Douglas J. Fukuyama, to go through for these kind of elaborate studies on molecular evidences of evolution. With this, I would like to thank you and happy learning.